Sherlock Holmes and The Case of the Winter Visitor, by Paisley MacDonald, being an account by Dr. John H. Watson, M.D., of a singular case investigated by Mr. Sherlock Holmes in the winter of 1895. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Sherlock Holmes that the cases which leave the deepest impression upon me are not always those which tested his mind most severely. Sometimes it is the human circumstance surrounding the mystery, the grief, the concealment, the shame nursed across years until it becomes indistinguishable from character, that lingers in memory long after the clues have been accounted for and the principals removed from the stage. The Adventure of the Winter Visitor is such a case. London in January of 1895 was a city held in iron. Frost had arrived without apology in the last days of the old year, and showed no inclination to leave. The railings of Baker Street wore silver each morning, the Thames exhaled cold mist from bank to bank, and the yellow fog which is London's especial affliction hung low over Bloomsbury and the legal quarter near Lincoln's Inn, sitting so heavily in the courts and alleys that gas lamps burned through the afternoon like blurred moons. Hansom cabs hissed over damp cobbles, telegram boys stamped their boots in doorways, and in respectable households throughout the city servants carried hot coals from room to room to maintain the illusion that England was a comfortable place in which to live. I had called upon Holmes that Tuesday morning more from want of occupation than any particular expectation. My practice was quiet in such weather. The very cold that drove patients to their beds kept them from venturing out to my door, and I found the rooms at Baker Street, if not exactly cheerful, at least preferable to the solitude of my own consulting room. Holmes himself was in one of his reflective moods, seated in his old dressing-gown by the hearth, with a pipe unlit between his fingers, his grey eyes fixed on the middle distance in that attitude of profound internal attention which I'd learned to distinguish from simple idleness, though the untrained observer might confuse the two. Mrs. Hudson had brought fresh coals and retreated. I was reviewing some old case notes by the window. The light was better there even through frosted glass, when the bell below gave a single decided ring. "A woman," said Holmes, without turning his head. "She is in moderate distress and has walked from no great distance. Note the decisiveness of the ring, Watson, not the tentative press of someone uncertain whether she has the correct address, nor the insistent rattling of someone in genuine panic. A single firm stroke, the action of a person who has made her decision, gathered her resolve, and intends to see it through. She has been standing outside for perhaps 2 minutes, working up the final will. That is a great deal to derive from a doorbell. The bell combined with the frost, Watson. Anyone who had arrived by cab would be on the step within seconds of the vehicle departing. She has been standing in the cold. She thought about leaving and decided against it. The guess, I'm not certain a better word exists, though Holmes would object to it strenuously, proved correct. Mrs. Hudson showed up a woman of perhaps 33, tall and plainly dressed in black, with a quality of composure about her that struck me immediately as the composure of discipline rather than ease. She was not naturally calm. She had made herself calm. Her eyes, dark and direct, moved from me to Holmes and settled on Holmes with an expression I recognized as characteristic of those who come to Baker Street at last, after having argued themselves out of it several times. Relief mixed with a residual unease at the spectacle of the man. Holmes rose and gestured her to the basket chair. I closed my notebook. "Miss Agnes Wrotham," said Holmes before she had spoken her name. "You keep house for a brother in professional life, a solicitor, I think, and you have recently experienced a considerable shock, one which the police regard as insufficient basis for further inquiry. Pray sit down and tell us everything in precisely the order it occurred." She did not ask how he knew her name. She had, I think, been told to expect this sort of thing. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, not clasped tightly as with anxiety, but set together with deliberate stillness, and began her account. You are very nearly correct in all particulars, Mr. Holmes. My name is Agnes Wrotham. My brother Edwin was a solicitor of some standing, with chambers in Gray's Inn. I have kept his house in Russell Square for 11 years, since the death of our mother. I am not a nervous woman, nor, I think my neighbours would confirm, given to fancy. That is already evident, said Holmes quietly. Continue. She spoke with that grave precision which belongs to persons too sensible to indulge terror, and therefore all the more alarming when terror has mastered them. She told us that beginning on the 22nd of January, a gentleman had appeared at the Russell Square house 3 nights running, arriving on each occasion at precisely 9 o'clock in the evening. He gave no name to Mrs. Pike, the housekeeper, who admitted him, only a murmured assurance each time that Mr. Wrotham expected him. He wore a long dark coat, a grey muffler wound high about his chin and throat, and tinted spectacles of a kind that suggested either delicacy of vision or deliberate concealment. He was thin, erect, and carried himself with a quality she described as sorrowful, though she admitted she could not see his face clearly. Each visit lasted no more than 10 minutes. On each occasion Edwin Wrotham received the caller in his study with the door closed, and on each occasion, when Agnes had ventured to mention the visitor afterward, with the natural concern of a sister who observed her brother's colour darkening and his sleep worsening, Edwin had denied, with a flatness that admitted no argument, that any caller had come. He did not deny it angrily? Holmes asked. No. That is what frightened me most. He was quite steady when he said it. Not defensive, not sharp, just empty. As though the words came from some part of him that had decided not to speak truthfully and saw no reason to be troubled by the decision. On the 25th, the 4th such evening, Agnes had been listening from the upper landing. At 10 minutes past 9 she heard a sound she described as a short, trapped cry, immediately suppressed. She descended at once. The study door stood ajar. She pushed it open and found the room empty of any visitor, the curtains motionless, the fire low. Her brother lay collapsed upon the hearthrug, one hand pressed to his chest, the other clutching. She paused here, and I saw the first crack in her composure. A child's woolen muffler, small and faded, red and grey, that belonged to no member of the household and that she had never seen before in her life. Edwin Wrotham was alive that night. He died before morning without recovering the power of connected speech. The physician who attended him and the police surgeon who followed were of one mind: cardiac collapse, consistent with his age, and a constitution that Agnes confirmed had been weakened by overwork and poor sleep. Inspector Gregson, who made the call a ceremony of such brisk and professional brevity as to communicate his firm opinion that no ceremony was necessary, had confirmed that he saw no reason to pursue any inquiry. "The muffler," said Holmes. He had not moved from his chair, but his eyes had acquired that peculiar intensity which told me the case had engaged him. "You retained it?" She opened her bag and placed it on the table before him. A small thing, the kind of muffler that charitable institutions used to issue to children, machine-knitted in institutional colours with a faint marking near one end in laundry ink that the years had reduced to near illegibility. Holmes examined it for perhaps 30 seconds. He held it to the light. He passed it once, briefly, beneath his nose. Then he set it aside with the care of a man placing a document in evidence. "You have searched the study since your brother's death," he said. It was not a question. Agnes did not flinch. "I have. I am not ashamed of it. The police were content to take the doctor's word, and I was not. I found that several papers were missing from a locked case that Edwin kept in the lower shelf of his desk. I do not know what those papers contained. I did not know the case existed until it was empty." "What would you like me to do, Miss Wrotham?" "I would like you to tell me who killed my brother," she said. "Whether English law is capable of accounting for it is for the moment a secondary question. Holmes looked at her for a moment with an expression that in another man might have been called respect. "We will call upon you in Russell Square this afternoon," he said. "In the meantime, touch nothing further." After she had gone, Holmes sprang from his chair with the abrupt energy that always followed a period of apparent stillness, as though he had merely been storing kinetic purpose. "Well, Watson?" "A remarkable woman, and a remarkable case. The visitor who leaves no trace, the denial that sounds nothing like a lie, the child's muffler in the hand of a dying solicitor. Yes, and the most important detail of all." He lifted the muffler and turned it so the laundry mark caught the grey window light. "Repetition, Watson. The visitor comes at 9 o'clock precisely, 3 nights consecutively. A ghost who keeps office hours is no ghost at all. He is an appointment. The question is not whether this caller existed. Miss Wrotham is not a woman who imagines silhouettes, but who arranged him, and to what purpose." He crossed to the mantel and stood looking down at the unlit pipe. "And why a solicitor who keeps buried papers should deny visitors who arrive to remind him of them. We arrived in Russell Square at 2:30, the afternoon already darkening toward a premature dusk. The Wrotham house was a tall, respectable townhouse with clean steps, polished brass, and the general expression of a dwelling that has made a religion of appearances. It was warm inside, but oppressively so, the warmth of drawn curtains and a household that had shut out the world and was now absorbed by the particular silence that follows death. Mrs. Dinah Pike, the housekeeper, received us with the manner of a woman who suspected every visitor of meaning harm, and had not yet revised this opinion in response to Miss Wrotham's introduction. She was somewhere past 60, heavy, loyal in her bones, and offended to the soles of her feet by questions about the household's management. She confirmed that a gentleman had called on 3 consecutive evenings. She had admitted him herself. "And you thought nothing unusual?" Holmes asked. "I thought the master chose his visitors and I chose his coals. My business is the second, Mr. Holmes." "Quite so. The gentleman wore a long coat, I believe. A grey muffler. When you admitted him on the first evening, from which direction did he come?" Pike considered this with an air of grudging concession that something in the question merited thought. "From the east, down along the square." "And when he departed?" A pause, long enough to be significant. "I showed him out. I showed him—" She stopped. Her expression altered slightly. "I heard him go," she said with less certainty. "The door." "But you did not see him pass through it?" "I was below stairs by then." Holmes thanked her pleasantly and let her go. He turned to me with a slight elevation of one eyebrow, a fraction of a gesture that I had learned to read as the equivalent of a fully expressed remark. We were shown to the study. It was a heavily furnished room, dark-panelled, smelling of good leather and the cold ash of a recent fire. Legal volumes filled the shelves with the dense respectability of a profession that values precedent. A large desk stood near the centre, with a chair behind it that bore the permanent impression of a man who had spent many careful hours in it. Holmes moved through the room with his characteristic swift economy. He examined the desk surface and paused over a pale ring in the leather, the kind left by a damp hat or a wet glove set down without thought. He crouched to examine the back of a wing chair positioned near the curtain that screened a door to the coal passage. "Watson, come here, if you please. Carefully." I crossed and looked where he indicated. On the dark fabric of the chair back, at approximately shoulder height, a faint grease mark, pale and slightly yellowed, the trace of something applied to skin or hair. I identified it with the instinct of a man who had spent time in theatrical circles as a young doctor. "Grease paint," I said. "Stage grease paint, yes. The specific preparation used for altering the apparent age of a face. Applied to the neck or jaw, it reads as deeply lined skin in lamplight." He straightened and examined the curtain over the coal passage door with 2 fingers, not touching the fabric more than necessary. This passage leads to the coal cellar, and from there to the side of the property. A man who knew the house could enter and depart this way entirely unobserved by Mrs. Pike, whose station below stairs gives her a view of the front door only. He examined the desk lock next, a small brass mechanism of good quality, and said without looking up, "Opened recently with a key that does not belong to it. The scratches are fresh. Silver bright. The original key would leave no marks on its own lock after 11 years of use. Someone used a duplicate. A good one, but not perfect." The papers, Agnes confirmed, had been kept in a locked document case in the lower drawer, private files that Edwin had always insisted on managing himself. The case remained, forced open and empty. Holmes stood a moment in the centre of the study, turning slowly, as if reading the room. Then he nodded, once as though making a private notation. "Who else had access to this room in your brother's absence?" he asked Agnes. "Mr. Bellamy, his clerk. He brought papers occasionally. Mrs. Pike, of course, and myself, though Edwin preferred I did not come in without occasion. We found Arthur Bellamy in the ante-room where the household's administrative correspondence was managed. A young man of perhaps 28, pale, thin-fingered, with the look of someone trying very hard to appear less frightened than he was. He was polite, careful, and answered Holmes's questions with a precision that was itself a form of evasion. He had not, he said, admitted any visitor. He had no knowledge of the missing papers. He had been employed by Mr. Wrotham for 3 years, and had every reason to wish his employer continued health. Holmes listened with a pleasant, almost bored expression. When Bellamy paused, Holmes said very gently, "The money-lender in Fetter Lane has been patient, Mr. Bellamy. But patience of that particular kind is never free. How much do you owe him?" Bellamy went extremely white. How did you—" "The envelope in your coat pocket bears his firm's stamp. You have been to see him recently. The mud on your boots corresponds to that particular court off Fetter Lane which was resurfaced in November and still sheds a distinctive pale clay. I raise the matter not to threaten you, but to establish that your position with Mr. Wrotham was one you could not afford to lose. A man in such circumstances does not murder his employer. He does, however, sometimes borrow access to his office for purposes he would prefer to keep private. Have any papers left this study by your hand?" Bellamy's hands had been clasped before him. They tightened. "Nothing of value. Notes on routine matters. Mr. Wrotham was careful to keep anything significant secure." Holmes thanked him as pleasantly as he had thanked Mrs. Pike, and we left the house. We spent the following morning in interviews that moved between the clerk's hired lodgings off Holborn, a conversation with Mrs. Pike, conducted on the pretext of returning a lost item, and a walk in the bleak churchyard behind St. Bride's, where Holmes spoke for some time with a pale and quietly spoken woman named Sister Helena March, a visiting nurse attached to a charitable institution she identified as St. Albans Children's Refuge, near Holborn. The morning yielded 3 sorts of concealment, and Holmes distinguished carefully between them as we walked. Bellamy conceals his debts because he is afraid, but his fear is self-interested and does not point toward murder. Mrs. Pike conceals wounded professional pride. She is mortified that a stranger could apparently come and go through a house she manages without her knowledge, and so she has revised her own memory to remove the inconsistency. She did not, in fact, hear the door close. She assumed it. "And Sister Helena?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. "She conceals indignation, Watson. Moral outrage so long nursed that she has learned to keep it from her face. But her indignation is not directed at us. It is directed at the past. She knew Edwin Wrotham by reputation before his death. This proved the most significant thread we had yet pulled. Sister Helena, when Holmes had pressed her with characteristic gentleness about the refuge's history, had given us a piece of information she had evidently debated sharing. Several years ago, she placed it at 8 or 9 years, a child at St. Albans named Thomas Ellie, aged 7, had died following a period of neglect and inadequate medical attention. An inquiry had been opened, papers had been gathered, a solicitor engaged by the institution's principal donor had overseen the management of those papers. That solicitor had been Edwin Wrotham. The inquiry had been closed. The findings had been minimal. The donor had continued his patronage, his name preserved. Thomas Ellie's death had been recorded as the consequence of a pre-existing weakness of constitution. Sister Helena had repeated this last phrase with a flatness that expressed her opinion of it more eloquently than any protest could have done. "The muffler," I said when Holmes had relayed the full account over supper that evening. "It belonged to the child. Thomas Ellie." "I believe so. Institutional laundry marks are meticulous things. They have to be, with dozens of children's garments to track. The marking on the muffler is faded but not erased. If the refuge keeps its old ledgers, I expect we will find Thomas Ellie's name and his muffler number in the same line." He sat back and steepled his fingers. The fire spoke quietly to itself in the grate. "What do we have, Watson?" "A solicitor who suppressed evidence of a child's death to protect a donor and his own professional standing. A solicitor who, 8 years later, receives a nightly visitor who arrives at a precise hour, departs without trace and leaves him so altered in spirit that he will not acknowledge the visits, who carries to his dying hand a garment belonging to that dead child." "Someone wanted him to know they knew," I said. "More than that. Someone wanted him to know the past was not buried. It had walked back across the threshold and counted the hours in his study." He paused. "The question is, who loved Thomas Ellie enough to wage a campaign of such systematic and patient pressure? And who had access to the muffler?" He took up his pipe. "Tomorrow, Watson, we go to St. Albans Refuge." St. Albans Children's Refuge occupied a grim brick building set back slightly from the street, as though aware that its plainness was a form of honesty. Its polished corridors smelled of starch, carbolic, and boiled broth. Nursery benches lined its hallways. Its account books were maintained in a small, neat hand, and the woman who maintained them sat at the centre of the institution with the composed authority of someone who had long since made herself indispensable. Mrs. Lavinia Cressel was 50 or thereabouts, thick-set, dressed in dark good cloth, with a quality of surface efficiency that I placed immediately as the management style of a capable woman who had learned to function without sentiment and mistaken that capacity for virtue. Her eyes were steady, and her reception of Holmes's questions was prepared. Too prepared, as I noted, for someone receiving an unexpected visit on an unannounced pretext. She knew why we had come. She had been expecting this visit, if not this particular form of it. She said all the correct things about the tragedy of Mr. Wrotham's death, about the charity's long-standing commitment to the children in its care, and about the regrettable misfortune of Thomas Ellie, which had been a great sorrow to all who knew the boy. Holmes listened with his head tilted very slightly to one side, which I recognized as the attitude he assumed when he was not listening to what was being said, but to the architecture of the saying. He asked if the refuge kept its old laundry ledgers. Mrs. Cressel said she believed some records had been preserved, though the older ones were imperfectly organized. Holmes said he would be grateful to examine them. She sent for the records with a composure so complete and so immediate that I began to understand it was performance. The ledger Holmes wanted covered the year of Thomas Ellie's death. I watched Holmes's finger move down the columns, the neat institutional rows of garments, children's names, numbers, and stop. He turned the ledger and showed it to Mrs. Cressel with an expression of perfect pleasantness. "Muffler, red and grey wool, laundry number 47, issued to Thomas Ellie, aged 7, not returned to inventory at the close of the boy's residency, He turned to an earlier section of the same records without comment. I caught a glimpse of a column headed in the same small institutional hand. Admissions, with dates, ages, and beside each entry, a line for family particulars. He read it for perhaps 15 seconds, then returned the ledger to its original page. Mrs. Cressel looked at the entry. She said nothing. "You have had the muffler for 8 years," said Holmes. "You kept it because a child died, and the record of how and why he died was expunged by a solicitor who had more to protect than Thomas Ellie's memory. The silence in the office was of a particular quality. It had edges. "I do not think this conversation serves any useful purpose, Mr. Holmes," said Lavinia Cressel. "Perhaps not, for you," Holmes agreed. "For me it has served an excellent one." He rose and thanked her, and we departed. In the cab, Holmes directed us first to a theatrical copying office in the Strand, where after a quarter-hour's inquiries he identified a man named Paul Merrow, a former actor currently employed as a reader and copyist, who had taken unexplained leave on 3 consecutive evenings earlier that week, and who was described by his supervisor as a thin, courteous, anxious man of uncommon skill with altered appearance. The last piece set its edge against the others, and the shape became complete. Holmes wrote that evening to Gregson, to Miss Wrotham, and to several others whose presence he required. The gathering was arranged for the following afternoon at the Russell Square house at 4 o'clock, in the study where Edwin Wrotham had died. I have attended a number of such assemblies in my years with Holmes, and I am never entirely free of the theatrical quality they possess. The lamps lit against the early winter dark, the principals arranged about a room which has become a stage, the expectation of revelation that hangs over the gathering like a held breath. On this evening, the cold had deepened. Ice had formed on the inside of the coal passage window, and the gas lamps burned steadily in the still air. Present were Miss Agnes Wrotham, pale and composed at the desk, Mrs. Pike near the door, her expression suggesting she had dressed for a trial and intended to acquit herself well. Arthur Bellamy in a corner chair, his hands arranged with visible effort. Sister Helena March, seated apart with a stillness that I read as braced expectation. Mrs. Lavinia Cressel, near the curtained coal passage door, her composure complete and rather magnificent. Paul Merrow beside her, thin and hollowed in the lamplight, with the look of a man who has been waiting to be caught and finds the moment partly a relief. Inspector Gregson, to Holmes's right, with a notebook that he held like a shield, and myself. Holmes stood before the cold hearth. He did not begin with the false trails. He began at the end and worked inward, which was not his invariable method, but was, I think, appropriate here. "Mr. Wrotham is dead," he said. "The question before us is not whether he was a good man, but whether his death was the natural consequence of his constitution or the foreseeable consequence of a campaign directed against him. I believe the answer is the latter, and that English law will require at least 2 people in this room to answer for it." He paused. No one spoke. "Let me dispose first of those who are not responsible. Mr. Bellamy borrowed access to this study on at least one occasion to remove a document relating to his personal debt, a promissory note Wrotham held over him. He is guilty of petty theft and of the considerable human failing of making a bad situation worse, but he has no connection to the visitor and no connection to St. Albans Refuge." Mrs. Pike admitted, and apparently lost track of a caller she assumed the house expected, and later revised her memory out of professional pride. She is innocent of everything but imprecision. Sister Helena March knew of Wrotham's suppression of the Thomas Ellie inquiry and was revolted by it, justifiably so. But she sought to right the record through testimony, not through terror. She is innocent. He turned slightly, so that the lamplight caught the angular lines of his face. "Thomas Ellie was 7 years old when he died at St. Albans Children's Refuge. He died of neglect, of inadequate care, of the practical consequences of a badly managed institution that concealed its management failures from its inspectors and its donors with the assistance of a solicitor who was paid to make inconvenient truths orderly and safe. Edwin Wrotham suppressed the inquiry that might have established accountability for Thomas Elley's death. In doing so, he preserved the reputation of the institution's principal donor and secured his own professional future. He buried his guilt in locked papers and went on to become a respectable solicitor of 46 with cold feet and bad sleep. Holmes moved to the desk and lifted a cloth that had covered a small collection of objects. Beneath it, the child's muffler, red and grey, faded with age, a laundry ledger open to the relevant page, a short length of duplicated key, and a small glass vial containing what I recognized even from 4 feet away as stage grease paint. Mrs. Cressel discovered, perhaps 2 years ago, that the evidence still existed. The refuge inquiry papers that Wrotham was meant to have managed into harmlessness were not entirely destroyed. She obtained copies. She decided that the ordinary channels of justice had failed and would fail again, and she devised an alternative. Mrs. Cressel's expression did not change. It was, if anything, more complete in its composure. She engaged Mr. Merrow, who had played many parts in his theatrical years and now played the most important one of his life. She dressed him in old clothes, coat and muffler of a style 20 years obsolete, and had him apply grease paint to throat and jaw to suggest an aged face. She instructed him to arrive at precisely 9 o'clock, 3 nights consecutively, to say nothing, to sit for 10 minutes in the study while Wrotham recognized in him the ghost of everything he had suppressed, and to depart by the coal passage, the route she had identified through her former access to Wrotham's household as his legal correspondent. She had arranged a duplicate study key through a locksmith who owed the refuge a favour. I heard Bellamy draw a sharp breath. Sister Helena's hands had closed in her lap. The figure Merrow presented was not random. He was composed to suggest, in dim lamplight and in the imagination of a guilty man, a specific memory. He wore the physical qualities that Wrotham would associate with Thomas Elley's father, a man from the refuge records, long dead, because Mrs. Cressel understood that guilt is not addressed by logic. It is addressed by atmosphere, by repetition, by the terrible drumbeat of something you thought buried arriving on schedule. Holmes set his hands behind his back. Wrotham denied the visits because to acknowledge them would have required him to explain them. He could not explain them without confessing what they meant, so he denied them and hoped they would stop, and they did not stop, and his heart, which had been carrying a weight of concealed guilt for 8 years, began by the end of the 3rd visit to show signs of losing its argument with the burden. He looked directly at Lavinia Cressel. On the 4th evening you came yourself, not Merrow. You. You entered through the coal passage with the muffler and the original papers. You sat before him and showed him the proof that his suppression was documented, that Thomas Elley's death was on record as the consequence of negligence abetted by professional misconduct, and that you intended the world to know it. He looked at what you placed before him, and his heart stopped. The silence had the quality of something spilled. You removed the papers when you saw he was dying, not to conceal the crime from investigators, but because you believed they were evidence belonging to the children they concerned, and not to a corpse or to Scotland Yard. You heard Miss Wrotham on the landing as she began to descend. You departed through the coal passage as she reached the stair, a matter of seconds before she came through the door. You left the muffler because you wanted it to remain. You wanted someone to ask what it was. Mrs. Cressel spoke for the first time in many minutes. Her voice was controlled and entirely steady. He killed that boy by silence, Mr. Holmes. He made that boy's life worth less than a donor's comfort and his own advancement. I did not harm him. I showed him the truth. Whatever his constitution made of that truth was his constitution's affair. And Thomas Elley's affair, said Holmes quietly. and English law's affair, Mrs. Cressel. The law does not always reach the moral dimensions of a case, but in this instance it will reach as far as intimidation preceding death and concealment of material evidence. That is sufficient for Inspector Gregson." Gregson, who had been very still throughout, straightened with the air of a man emerging from a lecture he had found unexpectedly absorbing. He nodded once and moved toward Lavinia Cressel. She rose without being asked. Merrow, beside her, seemed to collapse slightly in his chair and then, with visible effort, rise to stand beside her. They were not a pair who belonged together, the composed matron and the anxious former actor, except in the specific alliance of the guilty conscience and the hired instrument. But they left the room together, which was something. Holmes and I shared a cab back through frozen London, the gas lamps throwing their wavering circles on the icy pavement below. The city moved around us as cities do, indifferent, occupied with its own enormous business, unaware that in a panelled study in Russell Square a mystery had just accommodated itself to an ending. I thought for some time before speaking. "Will they be convicted?" I asked at last. Holmes considered. "Of what precisely would be the interesting question? The law has several long arguments available to it. Merrow can be shown to have entered the house without authorization and engaged in a scheme of intimidation." Mrs. Cressel directed him. "Whether Wrotham's death constitutes a foreseeable consequence of that intimidation, in the legal sense, will exercise several barristers through a long and expensive winter, and the result will depend upon the disposition of whoever sits above them. Wrotham's suppression of the inquiry meanwhile is 8 years old, and much of the relevant evidence went with the papers Mrs. Cressel now controls." "Then justice," I said, with a flatness I did not try to conceal, "may not encompass Thomas Ellie." "Thomas Ellie has been beyond the consolation of justice for 8 years, said Holmes. He did not say it harshly. He said it as a man states a fact about the climate. "What remains is accountancy. Mrs. Cressel believed she was practicing a delayed form of it. I do not think she was entirely wrong, Watson, and I find that a more uncomfortable thought than I would prefer." The cab swayed over a patch of ice and steadied. "Agnes Wrotham," I said. "She will live now with the knowledge that her brother was a man who made a catastrophic choice in comfortable circumstances and spent the rest of his life being slowly unmade by it. Yes, that is the particular cruelty of the case from Miss Wrotham's perspective. She has proof that there was human agency, which is what she came to Baker Street wanting. She now finds that agency more complicated and her brother more fallen than she had prepared herself for." He looked out the cab window at the dark street. "There is a temptation to say that Wrotham's death was, morally speaking, explicable. He concealed the death of a child and was subsequently frightened to death by a systematic reminder of that concealment. The mathematics seem tidy. But conscience is not an executioner with proper legal authority, Watson, however patient it proves. Mrs. Cressel appointed herself to an office that does not exist, and a man, however guilty, died in consequence. The moral weight of that is not simply distributed." He said nothing further for some time. Baker Street resolved itself from the fog ahead, the familiar shape, the lit window of 221B warm against the dark. We descended, and Mrs. Hudson let us in, and the warmth of the house rose around us like something earned. Holmes stripped off his coat and settled into his chair with the bonelessness of a man who has been elsewhere for some time and is glad to return. He closed his eyes. The fire worked quietly at its coals. I poured myself a brandy and sat across from him, listening to the city outside, the distant clatter of a late hansom, the muted cry of some foghorn on the river, the ordinary machinery of London in January, hard at its cold work. After a time Holmes spoke, without opening his eyes. "The muffler, Watson. She left it on purpose. No jury will convict a woman who left a dead child's muffler as evidence of herself. They will convict her for the trespass and perhaps for more. But the muffler That was not concealment. That was argument. She wanted to be understood, I said. She wanted someone to ask what a child's muffler was doing in the hand of a dead solicitor. She knew someone would. She placed it there believing that the answer, once found, would be harder to suppress than Thomas Ellie was. He opened his eyes then and looked at the ceiling. She was not wrong. As I sat in that warm room with the frost pressing at the windows and the fire settling toward its coals, I could not dismiss the consideration that the most disturbing cases are those in which all the logic is accounted for, and a discomfort remains none the less. I had known Holmes to close a case with absolute satisfaction. All the pieces fitted, the criminal removed, justice satisfied. I had known him to close cases with a shrug, acknowledging that the world resists neat endings. This case fell into neither category. It fell into the category of cases where the truth has been uncovered and found to be more tangled than the lie that covered it, where the guilty require more than a single verdict, and the dead require more than a single investigation, and what remains when the accounts are settled is the persistent knowledge that some debts are older than the mechanisms we have invented to collect them. Holmes stretched his long limbs before the fire and closed his eyes again, and I refilled my glass and prepared my notes. As I wrote, I found myself returning, again and again, to the Russell Square study, to the lamp-thrown shadows, the cold hearth, the small red and grey muffler on the table in evidence, and to the knowledge that no knock upon a London door is so terrible as one struck at last by the past. It arrives, as it arrived here, at precisely 9 o'clock, and it does not stop until someone opens the door. Note: Mrs. Lavinia Cressel and Mr. Paul Merrow were subsequently tried at the Central Criminal Court. Merrow was convicted of unlawful trespass and sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. Mrs. Cressel, on the evidence of her role in directing the scheme, received a sentence of 18 months. The suppressed papers relating to Thomas Ellie were produced at trial and, through the efforts of Sister Helena March, resulted in a parliamentary inquiry into the management of children's charitable institutions in the metropolitan area. Edwin Wrotham's name appeared in the inquiry's findings. Agnes Wrotham was not present for the publication of those findings. She had by then removed to the country, and Holmes, when I mentioned her name some months later, was quiet for longer than the question seemed to require.